The London rain tapped incessantly against Sophia's apartment window, mirroring the restless thoughts that had plagued her for days. She had been sitting at her desk, surrounded by half-finished sketches and crumpled papers, when the letter arrived. Its presence felt like an intrusion, a ghost from a past she had long tried to forget. Sophia's fingers trembled as she held the envelope. The return address, written in a shaky hand she barely recognized, bore her father's name, Carlos Mendez. She had not heard from him in 20 years, not since that tumultuous night when she had left, vowing never to return. The weight of the letter seemed disproportionate to its size. Sophia's mind raced with possibilities, none of them pleasant. She had built a life here in London, far from the shadows of her childhood. Her work as an illustrator had finally begun to gain recognition, and she had a comfortable routine that kept the past at bay. As she carefully opened the envelope, the scent of her father's cologne wafted out, triggering a flood of memories. Laughter echoing through their old house, the crash of a bottle against the wall, her mother's tears, her own screams. Sophia closed her eyes, willing the images away. The letter inside was brief, the handwriting unsteady. As Sophia read, her breath caught in her throat. Her father, Carlos, was dying. The words blurred before her eyes as she learned of his terminal diagnosis, his regrets, his plea for her to return. Sophia set the letter down, her mind reeling. She stood up abruptly, needing to move, to breathe, to escape the sudden claustrophobia of her apartment. She paced, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Memories she had suppressed for years bubbled to the surface. The good times, rare but vibrant, when her father had been sober, teaching her to draw, his eyes twinkling with pride at her talent. The bad times, far more numerous, filled with shouting, fear, and the acrid smell of alcohol. Sophia's gaze fell on a framed photo of herself and her boyfriend, James. They had plans, a future together in London. How could she explain this sudden intrusion of her past? How could she even begin to consider returning, to face the man she had spent 2 decades trying to forget? The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows. Sophia found herself at her desk again, staring at the letter. Her father's words seemed to leap off the page, demanding a response she was not sure she could give. As the day wore on, Sophia remained frozen in indecision. The letter lay on her desk, a bridge between 2 worlds, the life she had carefully constructed and the past she had fled. The choice before her was impossible, yet unavoidable. Return and confront the source of her deepest wounds, or stay in London and live with the knowledge that she had turned her back on her dying father. Night fell, and still Sophia had not moved. The letter waited, patient and unrelenting, a harbinger of changes she could not yet fathom. Tomorrow, she knew, decisions would have to be made. But for now, in the quiet darkness of her London flat, Sophia allowed herself to remember, to grieve, and to fear what the future might hold. The hum of the airplane engines filled Sophia's ears as she stared out the small oval window. Clouds drifted by, a stark white against the deep blue sky. She had made her decision, albeit reluctantly, to return to her homeland. The ticket in her hand felt like a sentence, each passing minute bringing her closer to a confrontation she had avoided for 2 decades. Sophia's mind wandered to the life she had left behind in London. Her small but cozy apartment filled with art supplies and half-finished projects. The promising career she had worked so hard to build. James, her boyfriend of 3 years, had not understood her sudden departure. His confusion and hurt had been palpable as she tried to explain, her words falling short of conveying the turmoil within her. As the flight attendant passed by offering refreshments, Sophia declined with a small shake of her head. Her stomach was in knots, a physical manifestation of her emotional state. She closed her eyes, leaning back in her seat, but sleep eluded her. Memories of her childhood home flooded her thoughts. The old house, with its creaking floorboards and the garden where she used to play, it had been a place of both joy and sorrow, laughter and tears. Sophia wondered how much had changed in her absence. Would the town still look the same? Would anyone remember her? Her thoughts turned to her father, Carlos. The image of him in her mind was frozen in time, a tall, imposing figure with a booming laugh and eyes that could turn from warm to icy in an instant. Now, according to his letter, he was dying. Sophia tried to imagine him frail and sick, but the picture would not form. As the hours ticked by, Sophia's anxiety grew. What would she say when she saw him? How would she react? The wounds of the past, though long buried, felt fresh and raw. She had spent years in therapy, working through the trauma of her childhood, but now she feared all that progress might unravel in an instant. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their imminent descent. Sophia's heart raced as she looked out the window, watching the familiar landscape come into view. The rolling hills, the patchwork of fields, the sprawling town. It all looked smaller than she remembered, yet somehow more daunting. As the plane touched down, Sophia gripped the armrests tightly. The finality of her decision hit her with full force. There was no turning back now. She was home, for better or worse. Gathering her belongings, Sophia moved with the crowd towards the exit. Each step felt heavier than the last. The air that greeted her as she stepped off the plane was warm and thick with humidity, so different from the crisp London air she had grown accustomed to. Sophia paused at the top of the stairs leading down to the tarmac. Below, she could see the airport terminal, beyond which lay the town, her past, and her dying father. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself for what was to come. With a mix of trepidation and resolve, Sophia took her first step back onto the soil of her homeland, unsure of what awaited her, but knowing she could no longer run from her past. The harsh fluorescent lights of the airport terminal cast an unforgiving glow as Sophia emerged from customs. Her eyes scanned the crowd, a mixture of dread and anticipation churning in her stomach. Then she saw him. Carlos stood near the exit, leaning heavily on a cane. The sight of him sent a jolt through Sophia's body. This frail figure bore little resemblance to the towering, intimidating man of her memories. His once dark hair had turned completely gray, his face lined with deep wrinkles. Even from a distance, Sophia could see the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped the cane. For a moment, Sophia considered turning around, fleeing back to the safety of anonymity. But Carlos's eyes met hers, and she found herself moving forward, her legs carrying her towards him as if on autopilot. As she approached, Carlos attempted a smile, but it came across as more of a grimace. The awkwardness between them was palpable, a physical barrier that seemed insurmountable. Sophia stood before him, her arms rigid at her sides, unsure whether to embrace him or maintain her distance. The silence stretched between them, filled with 2 decades of unspoken words and suppressed emotions. Carlos made a move as if to hug her, but stopped short, seeming to think better of it. Instead, he gestured towards the exit. As they walked, Sophia found herself instinctively slowing her pace to match her father's labored steps. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, noting how he winced with each movement. A confusing mix of emotions swirled within her: pity, anger, concern, and a deep-seated resentment she had carried for years. They reached the car, and Carlos struggled to lower himself into the passenger seat. Sophia moved to help him, but hesitated, her hand hovering uncertainly in the air before she pulled it back. She circled around to the driver's side, grateful for the momentary reprieve from the tension. As they drove through familiar yet changed streets, Sophia gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. She focused on the road ahead, trying to ignore the weight of her father's presence beside her. The drive continued in silence, the only sound the soft wheezing of Carlos's labored breathing. Sophia found herself stealing glances at him, each look revealing more signs of his illness: the pallor of his skin, the gauntness of his cheeks, the way his clothes hung loosely on his frame. As they neared their destination, Sophia felt a war raging within her. Part of her wanted to reach out, to offer comfort to this man who had once been the center of her world. Another part, the part that remembered the pain and fear of her childhood, recoiled at the very thought. They pulled up to the house, a structure that loomed in Sophia's memories like a specter. As she cut the engine, the silence became oppressive. Sophia sat still, her hands still on the wheel, unable to bring herself to exit the car and truly step back into her past. Carlos turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and resignation. Sophia met his gaze for a brief moment before looking away. She gave a small nod, words failing her once again. As they sat there, the weight of their shared history and the uncertainty of the days to come hung heavily between them, a chasm neither was yet prepared to bridge. Sophia stepped into her childhood home, the scent of old wood and faded memories enveloping her. The house creaked under her feet as if awakening from a long slumber. She had carried her single suitcase up the stairs, refusing Carlos's feeble offer of assistance. Her old room awaited her, a time capsule of her youth. As she pushed open the door, Sophia was struck by the preservation of her past. Posters of long-forgotten bands still adorned the walls, their edges curling with age. Her bookshelf remained untouched, filled with dog-eared novels and school textbooks. The sight stirred a complex cocktail of emotions within her. Nostalgia tinged with a bitter undercurrent of resentment. Over the next few days, Carlos made several attempts to bridge the chasm between them. He had prepared her favorite childhood meals, though Sophia noted his hands shook as he placed the dishes on the table. He had suggested walks in the garden, his voice hopeful yet strained. Each gesture, however well-intentioned, was met with Sophia's cool detachment. She observed his efforts through a lens of skepticism, unable to reconcile this frail, eager-to-please man with the father she had fled from years ago. One afternoon, while Carlos napped, Sophia found herself drawn to the attic. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the gloom. She moved carefully among the stacked boxes and forgotten furniture, her fingers trailing over surfaces thick with the residue of years. A particular box caught her attention. As Sophia opened it, she was confronted with a flood of artifacts from her past. School reports, old photographs, and small trinkets lay nestled within. Her hands trembled as she lifted out a faded photograph. It showed a younger version of herself, smiling broadly, with Carlos's arm draped over her shoulder. The image blurred as unbidden tears welled in her eyes. Beneath the photos, Sophia discovered her old diary. The lock had long since broken, and she hesitated before opening it. The pages were filled with the angry scrawls of her teenage self, detailing arguments and disappointments. Reading through the entries, Sophia felt the old wounds reopening, the pain as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. As she delved deeper into the box, Sophia unearthed more relics of her childhood. A report card with glowing comments sat next to a stern letter from the school principal about her behavior. A handmade Mother's Day card reminded her of the void left by her mother's absence. Each item seemed to carry its own weight of memory, some joyful, others painful, all contributing to the complex tapestry of her past. The sound of Carlos's cane on the stairs startled Sophia from her reverie. She quickly repacked the box, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. The memories had stirred up feelings she had long suppressed, anger at past hurts, confusion over moments of happiness she had forgotten, and a deep-seated sadness for the relationship that had been lost. As she descended from the attic, Sophia's face was a mask of neutrality, betraying none of the turmoil within. She passed Carlos in the hallway, nodding curtly in response to his questioning look. The ghosts of her past, awakened by the contents of that dusty box, followed her silently, unseen but acutely felt. That night, as Sophia lay in her childhood bed, she stared at the familiar cracks in the ceiling. The house settled around her, its old bones creaking in the darkness. She remained awake, caught between the past that surrounded her and the uncertain future that lay ahead, the weight of unresolved history pressing down upon her. On a humid afternoon, Sophia ventured into town, seeking respite from the suffocating atmosphere of her childhood home. As she wandered the familiar streets now altered by time, a voice called out her name. She turned to find Miguel, an old family friend, his face etched with surprise and concern. Miguel invited Sophia for coffee at a nearby cafe. As they settled into their seats, the weight of unspoken history hung between them. Miguel's eyes darted nervously, his fingers tapping an erratic rhythm on the table. He had aged considerably, his once jet-black hair now streaked with gray, deep lines etched around his eyes. After a moment of hesitation, Miguel began to speak. His words came slowly at first, then in a rush, as if a dam had broken. He spoke of events from years past, of secrets long buried. He told of Carlos's struggles after Sophia's mother left, of desperate attempts to hold the family together. Miguel revealed the existence of letters from Sophia's mother that Carlos had hidden away. Sophia listened, her face a mask of stone, but her mind reeling. The cafe faded into the background as Miguel's words painted a picture of a past she had never known. He spoke of Carlos's descent into depression, of nights spent drowning sorrows in cheap whiskey, of how Carlos had fought to keep custody of Sophia, fearing he would lose her as he had lost his wife. As Miguel's revelations continued, Sophia's emotions oscillated wildly between shock, anger, and a reluctant empathy. The father she had known, stern, often cruel, was being recast in a new light, not absolved, but complicated. With a heavy heart and a mind full of tumultuous thoughts, Sophia made her way back home. The house loomed before her, no longer just a symbol of her painful past, but now a repository of hidden truths. She found Carlos in his study, surrounded by old books and faded photographs. His frail form seemed to shrink further under her intense gaze. Sophia's voice was low and controlled as she confronted him, demanding answers about the hidden letters, about the secrets Miguel had revealed. Carlos did not deny anything. His shoulders sagged as he began to speak, his voice cracking with the weight of long-held secrets. He told of his own father's abuse, of patterns he had sworn to break but found himself tragically repeating. He spoke of Sophia's mother's departure, of the crushing guilt and fear that had driven him to make disastrous choices. As Carlos's revelations unfolded, Sophia stood rigid, her fists clenched at her sides. The anger she had carried for years clashed violently with a new, unwelcome understanding. Carlos's words added layers of complexity to their family history, blurring the lines between victim and perpetrator. When Carlos finished speaking, a heavy silence fell over the room. Sophia's mind raced, struggling to reconcile this new information with her long-held beliefs. The father before her was neither the monster of her memories nor the saint some might paint him as in light of these revelations. He was human, flawed, and broken in ways she was only beginning to understand. As the evening shadows lengthened, Sophia retreated to her room, leaving Carlos alone with the ghosts of his confessions. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying in her mind. The truth she had uncovered did not bring the closure she might have hoped for. Instead, it opened new wounds, raised new questions, and cast long shadows over her understanding of her past and her relationship with her father. In the quiet of her room, Sophia grappled with the realization that the path to reconciliation, if such a path existed, would be far more complex and painful than she had ever imagined. The buried truth had been unearthed, but its implications were yet to be fully understood. In the days following Carlos's revelations, Sophia found herself caught in a tumultuous internal struggle. The house, once suffocating with unspoken tensions, now seemed to echo with the weight of too many words. She had retreated into herself, spending long hours in her room or taking solitary walks in the overgrown garden. Sophia's mind churned ceaselessly, replaying memories from her childhood against the backdrop of her newfound knowledge. The stern father of her youth, quick to anger and slow to praise, now appeared as a more complex figure. She had glimpsed the scared, broken man behind the harsh facade, and this new perspective left her feeling unmoored. As she grappled with her emotions, Sophia observed Carlos from a distance. His health had taken a noticeable downturn since their confrontation. She watched as he shuffled through the house, his breathing labored and his movements pained. The sight stirred a confusing mix of emotions within her. Lingering resentment warred with an unexpected pang of concern. One evening, as Sophia sat on the porch, lost in thought, she heard a crash from inside the house. Rushing in, she found Carlos collapsed on the kitchen floor, his face contorted in agony. For a moment, she froze, the child in her terrified of approaching the man who had once been the source of her fear. But as Carlos let out a weak groan, Sophia's body moved of its own accord. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly before gently supporting his head. Carlos's eyes, clouded with pain, met hers, and in that moment, Sophia saw not the fearsome father of her youth, but a fragile, dying man. Without thinking, she reached for the phone and called for an ambulance, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. As they waited, Sophia found herself holding Carlos's hand, an act that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. She felt the weakness in his grip, saw the gratitude and regret mingling in his gaze. No words were exchanged, but in the silence, something shifted. The paramedics arrived, efficiently assessing Carlos and preparing him for transport. As they wheeled him out, Sophia caught a glimpse of fear in her father's eyes. Not the intimidating glare she remembered, but the vulnerable look of a man facing his mortality. Without conscious decision, she found herself following the stretcher to the ambulance. In the sterile hallways of the hospital, Sophia paced, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The anger that had fueled her for so long still simmered beneath the surface, but it was now tempered by a reluctant compassion. She thought of the letters Miguel had mentioned, of the struggles Carlos had faced, of the cycle of pain that had shaped their family. As she waited for news of Carlos's condition, Sophia grappled with the concept of forgiveness. Could she forgive the years of hurt, the emotional scars that still influenced her life? Was it possible to separate the flawed human father from the looming figure of her nightmares? She had no answers, only a growing awareness that the path forward was far more complex than she had ever imagined. Hours passed, and finally, a doctor approached with news. Carlos was stable but weak. As Sophia listened to the prognosis, she felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. The future stretched before her, filled with difficult decisions and uncomfortable conversations. Standing outside Carlos's hospital room, her hand on the door handle, Sophia paused. She was not ready to forgive, not fully. The hurt ran too deep, the memories too painful. But as she pushed the door open and stepped inside, she recognized that something had changed. A small crack had appeared in the wall she had built around her heart, letting in a sliver of understanding, a hint of compassion. As she took a seat beside Carlos's bed, Sophia realized that this moment of unexpected empathy was not an ending, but a beginning. The road ahead would be long and fraught with emotional pitfalls, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of healing. Not for Carlos's sake, but for her own. As Carlos convalesced in the hospital, Sophia found herself alone in the old house, surrounded by the ghosts of her past. One afternoon, while sorting through a cluttered closet, she stumbled upon an old, dusty guitar. The instrument had belonged to her mother, a fact that sent a jolt of surprise through Sophia's system. With hesitant fingers, she plucked at the strings, wincing at the out-of-tune notes. Yet, as she adjusted the pegs and strummed again, a forgotten memory surfaced. Her mother, face obscured by the haze of time, sitting on the porch, playing soft melodies as the sun set. Sophia had been young then, too young to fully appreciate the moment. Over the next few days, Sophia found herself drawn to the guitar. Her fingers, clumsy at first, began to remember patterns and chords she had not realized she knew. The music flowed from her, raw and untrained, but undeniably present. This unexpected talent, a clear inheritance from her mother, stirred a whirlpool of conflicting emotions within her. During one of her visits to the hospital, Carlos, his voice weak but his eyes alert, shared a memory. He spoke of summer evenings long past, when Sophia's mother would play the guitar and sing, her voice blending with the chirping of crickets. Sophia, he recalled, would dance in the yard, her small feet kicking up fireflies. The story caught Sophia off guard. It painted a picture of familial warmth that contradicted her long-held narrative of a loveless childhood. She listened in silence, her face a mask of neutrality, but internally she grappled with this new information. These positive memories challenged the foundations of her resentment, adding yet another layer of complexity to her already tumultuous emotions. As the days passed, Sophia found herself spending more time with the guitar, her fingers callousing as she played for hours. The music became a refuge, a way to express the turmoil she could not put into words. She played late into the night, the melodies carrying the weight of her confusion, anger, and reluctant understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia's phone rang. It was Mark, her boyfriend in London. His voice, once a source of comfort, now seemed to come from a different world. He spoke of their shared flat, of mutual friends, of the life Sophia had left behind. As she listened, Sophia realized how much had changed within her in such a short time. Mark sensed her distraction, his tone growing increasingly concerned as the conversation progressed. Sophia found herself unable to articulate the transformations she had undergone. How could she explain the shifting sands of her emotions, the rediscovery of a talent she had not known she possessed, the complex dance of resentment and understanding she was engaged in with her past? As the call ended, Sophia was left with a sense of disconnection. The life she had built in London, once so solid and defined, now felt distant and somewhat alien. She stood by the window, guitar in hand, struck by the realization that she was no longer the same person who had arrived at this house weeks ago. In the quiet of the evening, Sophia began to play again. The melody that emerged was haunting and bittersweet, echoing the complexity of her emotions. As her fingers moved over the strings, she allowed herself to acknowledge the changes taking place within her. The music spoke of pain, of confusion, but also of a tentative hope, not for a perfect resolution, but for a path forward through the tangled web of her past. As the last notes faded into the night, Sophia sat in silence. The journey ahead remained uncertain, fraught with emotional landmines and difficult conversations, but for the first time she felt equipped to face it. The guitar an unexpected ally in her quest to understand and perhaps someday to heal. The relentless march of autumn brought with it a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the old house. As leaves turned golden and fell, Carlos's health continued its steady decline. Sophia found herself caught in a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, watching as the man who had loomed so large in her childhood memories grew frailer with each passing day. Carlos had been released from the hospital, but his return home was far from triumphant. He moved through the house like a ghost, his steps faltering, his breathing labored. Sophia, despite her lingering resentment, found herself taking on the role of caretaker. She prepared meals that often went uneaten, administered medications with clockwork precision, and sat in silence during long, tense evenings. As days blurred into weeks, Sophia's phone buzzed with increasing frequency. Messages from Mark, from her friends in London, from her agent, all reminders of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. She had been vague about her return date, always pushing it back, unable to articulate even to herself why she remained in this house of fading memories and unresolved pain. One particularly gray afternoon, as Sophia helped Carlos to his armchair, she noticed a change in his demeanor. His eyes, usually clouded with pain or regret, held a spark of urgency. With trembling hands, he reached for a small, leather-bound book on the side table. Sophia recognized it as the journal he had been scribbling in during his more lucid moments. Carlos's voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper. He talked of time slipping away, of words left unsaid, of regrets that weighed heavily on his soul. As he spoke, Sophia felt a shift within herself. The anger that had been her constant companion for so long began to give way to a complex mixture of pity, grief, and a reluctant understanding. In that moment, Sophia was faced with a stark choice. She could return to London, to the life she had built for herself, leaving behind the unresolved issues of her past. Or she could stay, facing the painful truths and difficult conversations that awaited her. The decision weighed on her, a physical presence pressing down on her chest. As the day faded into evening, Sophia and Carlos found themselves engaged in the most honest conversation they had ever had. Words that had been bottled up for years spilled out, raw and unfiltered. Carlos spoke of his own father's cruelty, of the patterns he had sworn to break, but found himself tragically repeating. He talked of the day Sophia's mother left, of the paralyzing fear and inadequacy that had driven him to make disastrous choices. Sophia, in turn, gave voice to the pain and anger she had carried for so long. She spoke of the impact his actions had had on her life, of the relationships she had struggled to form, of the constant fear of becoming like him. Her words were not meant to wound, but to finally be heard, to have her experiences acknowledged. As they talked, time seemed to stand still. The ticking of the old grandfather clock faded into the background, overwhelmed by the weight of their shared history. Tears were shed, voices were raised, and silences stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. As the conversation drew to a close, Sophia found herself emotionally drained, but oddly lighter. The act of speaking her truth, of hearing Carlos's perspective, had not erased the past, but it had shifted something fundamental within her. She realized that forgiveness, if it came, would not be a single moment of absolution, but a long, complex process. In the quiet that followed, Sophia made her decision. She would stay, at least for now, not out of obligation or a sense of duty, but out of a need to see this journey through to its end, whatever that might be. She reached for her phone, composing a message to Mark that she knew would change the course of her life. As she hit send, Sophia looked at Carlos, frail and aged in his armchair. The future stretched before them, uncertain and likely painful. But for the first time in years, Sophia felt ready to face it, to confront the echoes of the past and the realities of the present. The road ahead would be difficult, but she would walk it with open eyes, no longer running from the shadows of her childhood. The winter sun cast long shadows across the room as Sophia sat by Carlos's bedside. His condition had deteriorated rapidly over the past few weeks, and the doctor's prognosis left little room for hope. The air in the room was heavy with the weight of unspoken words and fading time. Carlos stirred, his eyes focusing on Sophia with an intensity that belied his weakened state. His voice, barely above a whisper, carried a sense of urgency as he made his final request. He asked Sophia to scatter his ashes in the mountains where he had proposed to her mother, a place he claimed held the happiest memories of his life. The request hit Sophia like a physical blow. It was not just a simple task. It was a final plea for understanding, for connection, for a chance at redemption that Carlos knew he would not live to see. Sophia felt the weight of this request settle on her shoulders, a moral dilemma that forced her to confront her deepest feelings about family, duty, and forgiveness. As Carlos drifted back to sleep, Sophia retreated to the porch, seeking solace in the crisp winter air. She found herself reflecting on the trajectory of her life, the choices that had led her to this moment. The career she had built in London, the relationships she had formed and broken, all seemed to pale in comparison to the gravity of her current situation. Memories flooded her mind unbidden, childhood moments of rare joy interspersed with long periods of fear and resentment. The day she had left home, vowing never to return. The years of therapy trying to untangle the knots of her past. And now, here she was, contemplating a promise that would tie her to that past in ways she had never anticipated. As night fell, Sophia grappled with the concept of family. She had spent so long defining herself in opposition to her father, to the legacy of pain he represented. Yet now, faced with his mortality, she found herself questioning the rigidity of her stance. Family, she realized, was not just about blood or shared history, but about choices. The choice to understand, to forgive, to break cycles of hurt. The following days passed in a blur of hospital visits and quiet vigils. Sophia watched as Carlos's life ebbed away, each labored breath a reminder of the finality that approached. In these moments of forced intimacy, she saw not the towering figure of her childhood fears, but a flawed, human man grappling with the consequences of his actions. One evening, as the setting sun painted the hospital room in hues of gold and red, Sophia felt a shift within herself. It was not a dramatic moment of forgiveness, no angelic choirs or sudden epiphanies. Instead, it was a quiet acceptance, a letting go of the anger that had defined her for so long. She looked at Carlos and saw him truly, not as a monster, not as a saint, but as a complex individual shaped by his own traumas and failings. Taking his hand, Sophia made her decision. She would honor his last request, not out of obligation, but as an act of compassion for Carlos and for herself. It was a choice to end the cycle of hurt, to acknowledge the pain of the past without letting it dictate her future. As she spoke her promise aloud, Sophia saw a peace settle over Carlos's features. It was not a Hollywood moment of reconciliation, no tearful embraces or profound declarations of love. Instead, it was a quiet understanding passing between them, an acknowledgement of the complex tapestry of their shared history. In the days that followed, as Carlos's condition worsened, Sophia found herself navigating a complex emotional landscape. Grief mingled with relief, anger with understanding. She had not forgiven everything, nor had she forgotten. But she had chosen to move forward, to carry the lessons of her past without being shackled by them. As she made preparations for the journey to come, Sophia realized that this promise was not just about honoring Carlos's last wish. It was a commitment to herself, to face her past head-on and emerge on the other side, not unscathed, but stronger, more whole. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with moments of doubt and pain, but for the first time in years, Sophia felt ready to walk it, one step at a time, towards a future of her own making. The crisp mountain air bit at Sophia's cheeks as she stood atop the craggy peak, her father's ashes clutched in a small urn. The journey to this moment had been arduous, both physically and emotionally. Carlos had passed away 3 weeks ago, leaving Sophia to navigate the murky waters of grief and responsibility. As she prepared to scatter the ashes, Sophia's mind wandered to the tumultuous weeks that had followed her father's death. The funeral had been a small, somber affair. She had informed only a handful of Carlos's old acquaintances, most of whom she barely recognized. Mark had flown in from London, his presence a stark reminder of the life she had left behind. The weight of her recent decisions pressed heavily upon her. Her publishing agent had been less than pleased with her extended absence, hinting at missed opportunities and waning interest from potential collaborators. Mark, while supportive, could not hide his confusion and hurt at Sophia's reluctance to return to their shared life in London. Sophia's fingers trembled as she unscrewed the urn. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant snow. As she prepared to release the ashes, her hand brushed against something in her pocket, a letter she had discovered while clearing out Carlos's belongings. The letter, written in Carlos's shaky hand during his final days, had been a revelation. In it, he had not sought forgiveness or attempted to justify his past actions. Instead, he had shared memories, moments of joy and regret, dreams he had harbored for Sophia, and acknowledgments of his failures. Most surprisingly, he had encouraged Sophia to forge her own path, free from the burden of their shared past. Reading the letter had not erased years of pain, but it had offered Sophia a new perspective. It had shown her a side of Carlos she had never known, a man aware of his flaws, grappling with the consequences of his choices until the very end. As the ashes scattered on the wind, mingling with the mountain mist, Sophia felt a complex surge of emotions. Grief intertwined with relief, anger with understanding. She had not forgiven everything, nor had the hurt magically disappeared. But standing there, at the culmination of this journey, she felt a shift within herself. In the weeks that followed, Sophia found herself at a crossroads. The pull of her life in London, her career, her relationship with Mark, the familiarity, it all was strong. Yet, something had changed within her. The journey she had undertaken, both literally and figuratively, had altered her perspective in ways she was only beginning to understand. After much soul-searching, Sophia made a decision that surprised even herself. She chose to stay in her hometown, at least for a while longer. It was not a decision born of obligation or guilt, but of a newfound desire to explore the roots she had long tried to sever. She rented a small apartment in town, converting one room into a writing space. Her new project, she decided, would be a novel exploring the complexities of family, forgiveness, and the weight of generational trauma. It was a story she now felt uniquely qualified to tell, drawing from her own experiences while weaving in elements of fiction. Her relationship with Mark ended amicably, both recognizing that their paths had diverged. It was painful, but Sophia found strength in her choice, in the knowledge that she was no longer running from her past, but actively engaging with it. As autumn turned to winter, Sophia immersed herself in her writing. She joined a local writing group, forming connections with people who knew nothing of her history, who saw her simply as she was now. She even began volunteering at a youth center, working with children from troubled backgrounds. It was challenging work, often bringing up painful memories, but also deeply rewarding. One evening, as snow fell softly outside her window, Sophia sat at her desk, reviewing her latest chapter. Her eyes fell on a framed photo she had recently placed there, a picture of herself as a child, sitting on Carlos's shoulders, both of them laughing. It was a rare, happy moment captured in time. Sophia touched the frame gently, a small smile playing on her lips. She had not erased the pain of her past, nor had she forgotten the difficult years, but she had found a way to integrate those experiences into the person she was becoming. She was learning to honor the complexity of her family's legacy, acknowledging the hurt while also recognizing the moments of love, however fleeting they might have been. As she turned back to her writing, Sophia felt a sense of peace settle over her. The future stretched out before her, uncertain but full of possibility. She had made her choice, not to forget or to forgive unconditionally, but to move forward with open eyes and an open heart. It was a new beginning, one that acknowledged the shadows of the past while stepping bravely into the light of the future.